being here. This is our second webinar of the fall season. We'll be focusing on job applications and the job market in academia. So before we turn it over to the speakers, I'm just going to give a quick kind of rundown of what our organization is, and then we'll get on with the webinar. So this session is being hosted by the Student Affairs Committee for the Society of Conservation Biology North America. We're a professional society that focuses on, brings people together across various fields within conservation. Our mission is to provide a venue to connect diverse students and professionals to advance and apply conservation knowledge, and to welcome, support, and empower all voices engaged in conservation to contribute to equitable solutions and catalyze wonder for the natural world. So in other words, that means that we're really working to bring people together from all kinds of walks of life, all career paths, all fields that are all related to conservation, so that we're this really big, diverse, interdisciplinary organization. We hold conferences every 2 years, with our next one being in 2026 in Milwaukee. We also try to offer professional development opportunities like this workshop and others. And our members also have access to research and publications that are put forth by our global organization. If you're interested in learning more about our organization, you can scan this QR code. It just takes you to the website just to get more details. So as Bernie mentioned earlier, I am the chair of our Student Affairs Committee. As the name suggests, we work to put together resources and find ways to support our students and early career members, undergraduates, graduate students, and just early career professionals. We also hold social and networking events, especially more so in person at those conferences that I mentioned. Over the past couple of years, we focused a lot on technical skill building via workshops like this, virtual trainings, webinars. We had a webinar on R, GitHub, QGIS. We also hold career development opportunities and career exploration sorts of events like this, like panel discussions, mentoring events, and again, those social and networking events at our conferences. We have a pretty good group of people part of the committee right now, but we're always happy to have more people involved to help us plan some of these things. If you're an CBNA member and you're interested in being part of the committee, feel free to send me an email and I can add you to our email list. So as I mentioned, this is the second webinar of the fall season. The third one and final one for the fall is November 13th, and that was going to focus on job applications in the federal government in both the US and Canada. So that'll be using usajobs.gov and GC Jobs, which are both federal hiring websites. And then we'll have a break for the holidays, essentially, and then we'll come back in January or February with professional networking series, and then in spring and summer a series that's more focused on technical skill building again. It'll be data analysis related. So there's a lot coming down the pipe over the next few months. Feel free to follow on various social medias for more details about these upcoming events, or there also will all be on our website too. So at this point, I'm excited to introduce our speakers and get going with our webinar. The three speakers we have today are Martha Groom, Toby Daly-Engel, and Travis Seaborn. They're going to be talking to us about navigating the academic job market and job applications in academia. So I'll let each of them introduce themselves as they go. I believe we're going to start with Toby and then maybe Martha and then Travis after that. So each speaker is going to give a short presentation. And I think I'm going to ask that we hold questions till the end, until all three of our speakers have gone. And then we're just going to open the floor for general discussion and a Q&A session. Should be a pretty good time. All right. And with that, I will turn it over to Toby.
Thank you so much again for having me. So I am an associate professor at Florida Institute of Technology in Melbourne, Florida, which is all the way on the East Coast, sort of in the middle of the state. And no, I didn't know it existed either until I applied. But before that, I was a professor at the University of West Florida, and I left after 5 years to get, it was either go up for tenure or find a new job, because oftentimes getting tenure in one institution, then you leave, the next institution is probably going to want you to go through the tenure clock again. So it's actually, I think, easier to get a new job as an assistant than as an associate. So I've now been on the job hunt through 2 different cycles and was fairly successful, fortunately, both times. And I've been asked to go over kind of the different parts of a faculty application. And this is not going to be comprehensive. I'm sure there's other types of materials out there that I'm not familiar with. So I'll leave that to the other speakers. But the other thing I wanted to mention, and just kind of to open it up, is well, part of it is I study reproduction, but I have gotten a lot of questions because from female graduate students and postdocs because when both times I was interviewing for faculty jobs 5 years apart, I was hugely pregnant to the point where I couldn't like they fly you out and like I couldn't put the tray table down. All my interview clothes were maternity clothes, and so that was kind of an extra thing kind of going into it as a female potential faculty member who also works on like large macho creatures. So if anybody has any questions about that, about my experience, I'm happy to share that. It was not a bad thing. So in general, there are 4 parts of an application that are super common and other parts that are less common but becoming more so. So in general, you will be asked to provide a CV, which we all know is important. And of course, you must not be afraid to write stuff on that CV. You should be religious about keeping that thing updated, because by the time you go to apply for jobs, you might not remember half of what you did. You'll be asked to submit a cover letter, which isn't just like an email paragraph or two. It's like a 2-page long thing that you spend a lot of time on. And then there's a statement of research and a statement of teaching. And more commonly, you will probably be asked to provide a statement of diversity as well. And so your CV, of course, is your CV, but the thing you want to do is rearrange it depending on what you're applying for. So if you're applying for a giant research school, you want to have, your contact info, your position, maybe a brief history of your employment, but right away then you want to have grants and pubs, or pubs and grants, most likely grants and pubs, and then your research experience, and then your teaching experience. With more like teaching oriented schools, you want to bring your teaching experience up to the top, and your research, grants, pubs, all of that, it's still important, but it's not as important. So remember, with a CV, they can be super long. Mine's obnoxiously long just because I write it down every time I get like a hangnail, and as long as it goes up for peer review. And so that's not a bad thing. You want, to show what you've done, but remember, you draw attention to those things by bringing them to the beginning. Your cover letter, as I mentioned, is your introduction to the committee. It's the first thing they're going to read. And you don't want to restate your CV or restate your teaching or research statements, but that's an opportunity for you to introduce yourself, for you to talk in broad strokes about your experiences. If there's anything sort of different or unusual about your application, you may want to put it there. For instance, when I was moving, I mean, I was leaving my university. And so, you don't want to be like, I want to come to you because my university sucks, you might want to say like what I said, which is very simply that, I've really enjoyed my time in West Florida, but I really crave a more rigorous teaching environment, and I'd like to see what I could do here. Also, they found nooses on campus there, and I don't want to live there anymore. I didn't put that part in there, but it's true. So yeah, so you want to be honest about that. Sometimes people, if they have to take a long time off, if there's like a big gap in your CV, sometimes people will be like, I've had to take some time because I was like making a small human with my body. But now, I'm ready to blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of a blanket statement. Again, you're not recounting other material. You're just kind of summarizing it and putting your reasoning. Why are you applying for this job? Your statement of research is usually 3 pages long, and it can be really hard for people to synthesize your work down to 3 topics. I know I had that problem because when I went to do a faculty application, I was like, my experience is just a mix of so many random things that I just, was able to get experience with. But this really challenges you to kind of draw a through theme into, through your work. And what I have done and what my friends have done that seems to work is you can take your CV, literally take that whole thing and cut up every experience and see if you can put them into piles. See if you can kind of categorize them along broad strokes. And that's kind of where you can get those major themes. The other thing is to, you kind of end up making your path look a little bit maybe more like kind of intentional, if you will. Like for me, that ended up talking about my history in a way that I hadn't really thought about, that actually made a lot of sense, where I was like, I got a postdoc in Arizona studying giant water bugs. So I was able to, theoretically and empirically test these hypotheses that I developed on sharks for my PhD, which is true. And it sounds really good, but it was also like the only job I got. That's okay. It sounds really good in retrospect. So, this is really where you're crafting your narrative. And you may feel like, oh my God, I have no, everything's scattered. I don't know what I want, but this is your opportunity. And if, you really will find those themes, and it can really help you figure out kind of what you're interested in. And so you kind of say, here's my broad research interests. Here's the sort of a few paragraphs on the major focuses. And then I like to include some future directions of things that you will do at the university that you're applying for. Because just like a grad advisor wants to feel special that you chose their lab, a committee wants to think that, you came out of the womb wanting that job. It's the only job you've ever wanted. And so making sure that you're putting thought into what you would do at the university you're applying for. Have you realistically thought about it? What kind of area is it in? What kind of connections can you make to other researchers or other departments that you could potentially collaborate with? If it's an undergraduate institution that likes research, and all of these clues will be in the job ad. You can say, here's a bunch of bite-sized projects that I have right away that would be great undergrad projects. And also here is what I'm going to do at your school. And that last part is imperative. I did my PhD at a field station at the University of Hawaii, where you have a ton of invasive species and it's a big problem. And we had a coastal ecologist position interviewed for, and a gentleman who worked on, and this is a tiny island in a bay in the middle of Oahu. It's like incredibly resource rich, very fragile environment. And this guy studied a model fish. He studied zebrafishes. And everybody who came and did this, talk said, well, this is the most incredible natural laboratory on Earth. This is Hawaii. I'm going to study this. I'm going to study that. This guy said, I'm going to bring my zebrafish with me from Wisconsin. And that was the wrong answer, because you don't go somewhere like as incredible and full of natural and wonderful science questions and say, I'm going to bring a potentially invasive creature to your marine lab. And yeah, so focusing on where you're going is key. Your statement of research is usually about 2 pages, sometimes 3. And that generally talks about your teaching experience, but also your teaching philosophy. You don't, again, want to recount that CV, but you want to highlight certain experiences and talk about how they kind of built your experience that you have and what you're interested in teaching wise. If you haven't done a lot of teaching, that's okay. You can talk about how you mentored. You can talk about being a teaching assistant. You can talk about how teachers were, instrumental to you. And I'm sure the other speakers will have more to say. And then diversity statements I'm sort of dating myself here because I got this past job in 2017. And some places had them and some places don't, but I think they're becoming more important, which is a good thing. And that is literally where you talk about what you've done in the past to encourage the participation of underserved minority groups in science, and or what you will do to encourage that. And again, a little bit about your kind of personal philosophy. So I know I've talked a whole bunch and I'm going to stop talking now, but I hope that gave you kind of a little bit of an idea.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Toby. I think at this point, we'll pass it over to Martha.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, Toby, that was a great introduction. I'm Martha Groom. I'm at the University of Washington, Bothell, which is a liberal arts campus in the University of Washington system. I also hold a part of my appointment at the University of Washington, which is a major Research One university. I got my first academic job at North Carolina State University, and I was there for 3 years, and then I moved to my present position. And I have 2 children who are adults now. One's even in grad school. And I moved in part to have my life work out. And because I had a partner and he wasn't willing to move to North Carolina. And so I have also gone through 2 searches, but a long time ago. In my position here, I'm a full professor. I've been here a long time. I have served as the chair of numerous committees. I've been on numerous committees. I am currently serving as sort of the chair, acting chair right now, while the real chair is away, of a search for a dean. I also am on the campus council for promotion and tenure and have mentored a lot of people through their time. The University of Washington Bothell was created in 1990 to expand access to education, 4-year degrees in the state of Washington. We have master's degrees and undergraduate degrees, while we're barred from having PhD students. We are very socially justice focused, very serious about our intentions to support first-gen historically excluded populations. We have a lot of different diasporic communities here. There's a lot of change. Teaching is what we do most and first. And what I see is we have a shared passion of the faculty that come here really care about teaching. So that's a huge piece. So setting a little bit of that context, what would I add to what Toby's excellent, everything that she said, I agree with. I think it's really critical that for any job that you apply to, you have, don't just read the job ad, go to their website, wander around their website. How do they present themselves? What do they seem to celebrate? How does that resonate with you? I would advocate that it's also, at times you may see, even though having a job is great, having a job where you can't be yourself isn't great. So there are some jobs that you might, after you look at it, realize this is not going to be great. I do think it's very important to send as much as you can honest signals. The applications that are strongest take very seriously what they're looking for and what this institution is, and they say why I am a good fit for this place and what it is that I can do. It's when you feel that fit that application rises to the top, and it always does. And the ones that are very generic, and I want a job, trickle down to the bottom. So really connecting to what's going on at that place is absolutely critical. And it needs to be a pretty honest signal because you can really hear it. So tailoring that is critical. We are in an interesting time for trying to enhance equity in education. And depending on the state you're in, you can't use words like equity or diversity or inclusion anymore. So, for example, for our last search, we actually asked for a leadership statement. And by some of what we were asking for in that, you'd expect that a person would address these issues because they're so central. So it's an interesting thing, but that is one thing. You'll see different ways that you can kind of work around that. when when you are applying to a teaching focused institution, one thing that I think is actually quite critical, and that's difficult if you are coming straight out of your graduate work, or all postdocs are research focused, almost all, is to have enough teaching experience to compete with someone like Toby, who's coming from another faculty position and has a gob of teaching experience. So one thing I would encourage you to do, if teaching is a passion to you, as it was for me, I carved out ways to be able to be an instructor of record while I was still a graduate student. So I taught one course entirely on my own, and I co-taught with my major professor. I co-taught with a different instructor so that I could have some real teaching experience. And I was able to get my first job right out of the gate. So I just want to add that as a special encouragement. If teaching is your thing, try to get different kinds of experiences beyond the TA-ship, because just to be honest, you won't be very competitive with just a TA-ship if it's a true teaching focused institution. Many that are where teaching is important, that's fine, that's enough. And at a research one, that's enough. But it is rarely so when teaching is the be all end all of the place. I think maybe I will leave it. Oh, wait, there's one last thing. I loved the links that Toby gave you. I think are really right on. A tip that I would give you is, as you have crafted your first draft of whatever it is, force yourself to read that thing out loud. And if it sounds natural and it's your voice, you have done it. Because when you're on the committee, you're reading a lot of letters, and oh my gosh, they blend together, they sound the same. You're like, oh, who said what? And those letters where they really is that person, they just stick in your head. They're really glorious. So force yourself to do that. Read that thing out loud, and anything that doesn't feel natural, you need to work on that and make that your own. Okay, I'll pass it over to Travis.
Yeah, thanks. Both of you had a couple of good points. I thought the bits that I kind of thought that I would cover a little bit is just a touch about kind of my background and perspective that might be helpful, in particular when thinking about like potential questions that you might all have and things like that, and kind of building from there. There's also one additional kind of weird document that my university requires that maybe you haven't heard of before, so I'll cover that one too, which are extension documents. So yeah, so I'm an assistant professor at North Dakota State University. I started about 2 years ago. I'll echo something that Martha just said too. I actually ended up with an offer at a teaching heavy university. And a lot of that was because I like sought out a postdoc that let me do some teaching. Like that's the only reason I ended up being kind of competitive for those situations. And so I was kind of on two ends of the spectrum. So like I'm at the R1 land grant for North Dakota is where I ended up landing. We are on the smaller R1 side. Most of the positions that we advertise are research heavy. They're 70, 80% research positions, but not all of them. So, we had a search this summer that was 70% teaching. So we do have some tenured teaching positions that come out, but they're less common than some of the others. So I use this term land grant, which I assume at least some folks on the call have probably not heard that, but basically the land grant institutions were developed in 1862, I believe, with the Morrill Act. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because if you ever apply to a land grant, you have to keep a couple of key things in mind. And so land grants were formed to basically serve and educate the people of the land, I think is how it was originally phrased. So a little bit of history there, because if you apply to a land grant, fit is really important. And it kind of ties to that story about Hawaii. Like if someone applies to NDSU and has no desire to do research in North Dakota or in the Midwest, like that's a potential issue. So land grants have like a very special fit expectation, in particular if you're under kind of these broad umbrellas of natural resources and things like that. So, and that was the other piece that I wanted to touch in. So I my professor title, I think, is applied ecology, but I'm in the School of Natural Resource Sciences. Through my PhD, I was in bio departments. My postdoc was in fish and wildlife sciences and ecology and natural resources. So I've kind of bounced between bio and natural resources, and I'm happy to talk more extensively about that. But being in natural resources, there's definitely a bigger emphasis for doing applied work. And so kind of, again, teaching and educating and doing research for the area that's around you. So what that means is, I still have projects in other places. Um, in the summer, I've kept some of the research that I've been doing, like in the Teton areas with cutthroat trout, but I also had to develop some projects that are very much like in my area and serving my state. Because that's just part of the land grant mission. And so again, it's not just about looking at the job ad, it's about kind of understanding like what's the university and what's the department trying to aim for. Even though I'm at a land grant, if I was in the bio department, that like tie to applied work and serving the community is a little bit less when it comes time for promotion and tenure. So it's important to kind of think about some of these nuances when you put together your application. The funding sources are slightly different between basic and applied. As I put it in natural resources, basic are your NSF grants and applied goes to USDA. You might not necessarily think of what you do as being tied to agriculture, but like my USDA funding includes things like restoration work for native trout species and things like that. And so the USDA defines ag as a pretty broad umbrella, ranging from like social science to some of the chronic wasting disease work my lab does, things like that. And so there's that basic to applied piece to keep in mind. And because you'll see, a lot of universities will have a bio department, but then also something related to natural resources. Tend to be a bit more applied, sometimes a little more interdisciplinary, where we'll have social sciences in our types of departments. But keep an eye out for them. And I'd plug them a little bit because I've been on a couple searches here, and I have a decent network of other folks who've been on searches. And on the natural resource applied side of things, we tend to have smaller applicant pools compared to like R1 bio departments. I don't know exactly why this is. I've had like discussions with like 20 other faculty from across a bunch of different universities at one point, like at American Fishery Society, and we were just like, yeah, for some of us that are at land grants doing more applied work, we end up with smaller applicant pools. So I would encourage you, if you are interested in kind of that more applied side, which I think, if you're interested in conservation, that is a piece of applied work, to keep that in mind. The other piece then that I was going to mention is that at land grants, what you'll sometimes see is a requirement for what's called an extension statement or extension philosophy. This document is focused on what's called extension. And when I say extension, I mean like a big capital E. And what that means is basically education outside of the classroom, so community education. So if you've ever done like outreach or public presentations, if you formalize that a bit and kind of like do surveys before and after and see if people are liking what you're doing, that kind of falls under the extension piece. So, we have folks who, well, right now, like one of the searches I'm on is a honeybee position, and it's like I think it's 80% research, 20% extension. So there's an expectation that you go out and do public presentations to beekeepers. And that's a document that gets looked at just like a research statement. So, the goal here is to see, like, do you have plans on how to engage the community and how to educate those who are not in your classroom, to, again, benefit and educate the people of the land? And it's tied into that, at this point, like 150-year-old, Congress Act, but that's where those things are. So you'll sometimes see extension percentages at land grants, and that's what they're looking for. Coming straight out of PhD, again, like folks who are okay being on the competitive side, have done some outreach or some volunteer work, maybe your local library, things like that. Those who are more competitive, though, have done like more formal extension, like, hey, I've worked with farmers or beekeepers, or, I ran presentations for the Forest Service. The last little bit then, in terms of kind of hopefully little nuggets of knowledge that are helpful, kind of like what Toby and Martha talked about, was when you think about all these documents, it is a lot of work to put them together. And if you go look at the numbers for how many jobs people are applying to before they get one, it can make you pretty depressed. Not everyone falls into those camps, but it can take a lot of applications on the ecology evolution side to find a position. Um, my recommendation for you is to think how you personally can streamline the process without giving off that vibe of like, I'm applying to a bunch of places. So, like, I'll use my own strategy of like a lot of my statements, they're 2 pages and it's about a page and a quarter. That's really about like me and my research vision. And that part stays kind of the same. But then I'm very explicit on that last half page or so that's like, it's subtitled like research at such and such place. And I have a little piece where I talk about funding. I talk about potential collaborators. I go and spend time on people's pages, and I'm not starting from scratch then every time, but I'm also, then also not just like putting out the same 2 page research statement to every single person and just getting a bunch of rejections. So, and teaching is the same way. I have like the teaching philosophy that stays kind of the same-ish. That's, a little over a page long. And then I get into what courses at your university would I be interested in teaching and what new courses might I be able to offer, those types of pieces. So don't feel like every time you have to sit down to do one, you should be completely starting from scratch, but definitely make sure that you're reserving, force yourself to have that space that you have to fill about that specific job that you're applying to.
All right. Thank you very much, all three of you. That was some really good nuggets of wisdom in there. Those were great presentations. I think we'd like to go ahead and turn it over to just open discussion, Q&As. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand. I also have some discussion questions I can bring up if nobody else has anything. Well, I guess what people are thinking, I will go ahead and start with one question. Can you talk a little bit about any of you, and I think Toby is especially touched on this, but can you talk about making the jump between being a student or a postdoc with a really defined project, maybe with a lot of supervision? Maybe the project is one that you were given, rather than one that you conceived of yourself, to developing your own research program, developing a research statement, and kind of carving out your own research niche. Like, how do you kind of jump from A to B there?
I can take a stab at that. For me, it was very much driven by location. So I have a marine system, obviously. I actually did a postdoc in Arizona, believe it or not, on water bugs, but it was a fellowship, so I could do shark research while I was there. So for me, a lot of what I was sort of trying to do was envision how I could practically do research, meaning what if I wanted to do more or less what I'm doing, what I did for my postdoc and my PhD, then could I do it there? So I do molecular ecology, things like looking at invasive species and migration patterns and nursery habitat use. And so for me, it was all about finding places where I could practically do my work. And I should say one thing is that make sure when you're when you're doing a phone interview, or, when you get past that application phase, and I think Martha touched on this, which is that part of being prepared for that interview and doing that research on that university to look for all of the things that, that Martha and Travis were talking about, classes you could teach, people you could collaborate with. I really, I wasn't looking at jobs in Indiana because there was no ocean. So for me, it was all like, look, here is this amazing estuary. This school is right on the Chesapeake. This school is right on the Indian River Lagoon. This school's in the northern Gulf of Mexico. What are the sort of applicable questions that you could ask about the specific geography of that area? Another thing to do is to look at and just kind of take your cues from that. And another thing is you don't have to have it all figured out from the beginning. And it doesn't have to be the same, even research focus at every single university. And so the idea is simply that you kind of make a positive case for yourself. And along those lines is once you think about what you might need, to ask what if that stuff is available. And I kind of took that for granted. Like, I interviewed once for a school. They had access to water and whatnot. And I got, phone interview and I didn't think to ask about really general resources because I'm an ecologist and they were hiring an ecologist. But when I went there and I asked if there was lab space and where the lab space was for this position, they said, they were like, well, but you're an ecologist. Like, aren't you just like outside? And if I had asked that before, it would have kept my pregnant ass from having to go from Florida up to the Northeast for an interview for where they didn't have what I needed. So kind of what Martha was saying, when you're in that situation, you're interviewing them as well as them interviewing you, and taking in all of those things about what are the vibes, how does it feel. I think she mentioned the term fit, and that's a very sort of amorphous, ambiguous term that gets passed around, and it's kind of infuriating sometimes because you're like, why didn't I get that job? Well, it might just be because of fit. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And it's hard to tell, but when it's there and when it's not.
Great. I'll move on to Eloise's question in the chat. She says, Martha touched on how to be competitive in the teaching aspect, but as an early career applicant, how can you be competitive research-wise with someone who has come from another university? Whoever wants to take that question, go for it.
I'll jump in just for a little bit from the perspective of being on the search committees. So we did a search and had a real range, folks who are fresh out of their PhD, they haven't even filed the thing yet, to somebody who was just about to get tenured at their place after having done 2 full postdocs, so they're like 10 years out of this, right? And that, absolutely is a question. How do you consider across these different areas? And so this connects a little bit to Travis's point. Some of it was, well, what were the different research areas? What kind of work were they doing? At a place like mine, you need to incorporate undergraduates into your research. Is that something you could do? Or is it really not accessible for one reason or another? Would this be somebody who could contribute regionally to some of the pressing issues that we have right here? Is this work something that's just going to really excite like 8 different people on the faculty because they could see different connections and they just want to have conversations with you? It can feel like you wouldn't get as fair a shake because you just wouldn't have so much to offer. I'll just say in that search, we interviewed both those 2 extremes. We had one person who was at 10 years out and one person who hadn't yet finished their PhD. And both were highly competitive for the position because of the nature of the work that they did. And we weren't expecting in hiring someone who's fresh out to have as much behind them. And they would take the usual time to tenure. Somebody who's got all that stuff coming gets promoted faster but they do, as you said, they do start as an assistant. If you legally can't hire somebody with tenure unless you've crafted the job ads such that you say that you will. So if you say you're taking an assistant professor without tenure, you have to take the person on that way. I will stop. Let somebody else.
I want to add, sorry, Travis. Let me just jump in for a sec and address that question, because I think it does sound like the deck is stacked against somebody just starting, but those are also different types of calculus for the university. So like for me, before, I applied to a bunch of jobs coming out with 5 years under my belt, and that's a benefit. I have all that experience, but I'm also not cheap. I have a lot of experience. I will want a competitive salary. I will want a certain amount of startup. I may have stuff that I'm bringing with me, but if I'm going to make a move, it's got to be worth it. Someone just coming out of a postdoc who doesn't have a job yet isn't looking for a new one. I have something to fall back on. So someone who would interview me versus someone who would interview someone fresh out, they're potentially looking for two different kinds of candidates. If they want someone with experience, great. But a lot of places really prefer to hire people at the beginning of the career, and they can mentor that person. And someone with less experience who's not or doesn't already have a job to fall back on is potentially not going to necessarily cost as much as someone with a lot of experience.
The other piece that I would add as it relates to like this question plus the original one too is when the committees are evaluating folks, like Martha said, like there is this piece of trying to sort out like where are they relative to their career stage. And one of the pieces that I know we talk a lot about on our committees is that you hope to see them eventually become like an independent researcher. Like that's one of the big pieces for tenure here is kind of this independence. And so it can be a little bit daunting to be like, well, how do I kind of get there? Particularly if I had a PhD project that was maybe a little bit more structured with what the project would be. And the biggest thing that I would say is, if you are able to start looking at jobs early and you're able to start thinking about like, where do you need to kind of grow as a scientist? And that's something that you can then set into your own goals a bit in terms of your own development and like what types of postdocs you're looking for. For example, and we've interviewed folks who are kind of tail end of PhD, but the ones who do come in are those that even as a student have showed some independence to try and do additional collaboration, or maybe they tried to co-develop a new class. Like they show that independence piece because that's a really important bit. And I'll say that that's not something that necessarily goes away for better or for worse. As someone who like loves team science and does a lot of collaborative work, it's something that I'm very aware of and battle against a bit. But it's something that kind of comes up is this like, can you run a lab? Can you be independent? And I know the percentage of folks where I'm at that get tenure, it's a really high percentage. It's not quite everybody, but it's pretty close. And the folks who didn't get tenure, it was because they were still mostly publishing with like either PhD or postdoc mentors, and they never really like carved out that independence piece. So I would encourage you, like, if you're thinking about, well, that's something I kind of lack. Well, when looking at postdocs, like, can you find one that gives you a little bit of freedom to maybe try and develop a project with another postdoc, or, maybe do a side project with one of the grad students or some of these other things? Because, again, as a postdoc, you're not anticipated to like have your full-on lab with grad students like you might be if you're an assistant professor applying, but you can start to show evidence that you're trying to like grow in some of those ways. And I'll point to the current some of the current in recent searches we've had where those folks, again, coming straight through near the end of PhD, you can see like, oh, on the extension side, they've tried to like lead and do extra outreach things beyond just what their PI has done in the past. Like it's that kind of like that initiative that's really, it's a tricky one to evaluate, but really important. Yeah, and I'll actually kind of mention, just because I see Toby putting some other resources. One of the other ones, some of the stuff is data, it's not quite great, but is the professor is in. Some of the pieces are really helpful, and that was one that I went to as a PhD student, and that's actually where I got that advice from her about early on, find your job, see what you need to do, and then you can set up a plan to be able to get there. So if you know you're interested in research, go see what the research jobs are saying. If you know you're interested in teaching, see what that is, because you don't want to notice holes in your application packet when it's time to then apply for your kind of dream job. So I know I've been talking for a little long, but I'll add kind of really quick that like a specific example that was given for me there that I thought was really helpful was like, if you have never engaged to try and support diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher ed, it's really hard to then write a DEI statement. And so it's helpful if you're in like the first year or second year of your PhD and you start thinking, how can I be supportive of DEI at the university level? And so again, like that was a very tangible piece where I was like, okay, I can see how there's some stuff I can kind of pull from, but here over the next, 3, 4 years of my PhD, I want to make sure that I do these things and I understand the topic better and I'm able to grow in that way so I don't have the holes come time to apply for, the job you really want.
Right, great. I'll definitely keep reading questions out of the chat if they come up, but in the meantime, um, I will ask, in terms of teaching statements and diversity statements, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who's maybe later stage in grad school or even a postdoc already, who feels like maybe they don't have enough teaching experience to write a good teaching statement or enough experience with diversity to write a diversity statement? What might you advise somebody in that situation?
I'll take a stab at that. Well, so first let me say that so I was a little unusual. I had a teaching and research postdoc, and they do exist. Actually, the NIH IRACTA program is a really good one, which stands for Institutional Research and Academic Career Development Award. It's a postdoc that goes to it's an institution grant. So if you go to IRACDA at NIH, IRACDA, you can see the participating institutions, and they're really good at kind of trying to create that teacher scholar model, which you hear a lot more about now than you used to. So, we're talking a lot about teaching, but even if you're not going for a teaching school, it's still good to know whether or not you like teaching, right? Because a lot of us will have to, regardless of whether or not we want to. But I would say probably most people coming in to a faculty job don't really have any. I think it's kind of unusual, in fact. So on the one hand, you don't necessarily have to stress out too much. But if you're at a postdoc at a university, oftentimes they need adjuncts. You could always ask if there's the opportunity to teach a class for a semester or teach a lab. Another thing is, in the absence of if you were in a TA in grad school, if you have an advisor, ask that advisor if you could give a guest lecture in their class, or somebody else at the university who maybe has something close to your area. Talk to them, see if you can get that experience. And one thing that is really nice that isn't formal teaching experience is mentoring. So that's not exactly the same thing, but it is kind of, because we do so much of that mentoring in the lab and teaching and training other people that, that's something not exactly fudge, but there's something there to talk about. So if you talk about ways that you've successfully mentored people, there's also potentially, this might be more than you need, but little online classes on pedagogy, just, you don't necessarily have to teach an entire course or be an instructor of record to show that you're interested in teaching, to show that you're pursuing those skills, and be honest about it. You could say, I haven't had a chance to accrue as much teaching experience as I want to. Part of why I'm applying to your school. I'd really, I'm looking forward to the opportunity. I could teach this and that. You can also talk about how, teachers that have been important to you and classes that you've taken that were particularly effective, particularly interactive, things that, you kind of want to include in your teaching. That would just, I don't know, maybe the other speakers can kind of think of something, but on the one hand, teaching, it's not necessarily the most important thing unless you're talking a teaching heavy school. But at the same time, even if it's a research school, they want people who I mean, most places, they want people who can teach a little bit, you know? So it's not that teaching is not important at all. If you're going to a research school, it's just that it might not be quite as valued. But it's always good to try and get that experience, even if you don't think you want to go to a university that where you would have to teach, simply because so many of us end up doing it anyway, you know? And it's good to know if you like teaching. It's good to know if you don't like teaching, and to be honest about that. But also, it's not, you know, given that people are really looking for, as well, the NSF, very clear about their priorities of creating this sort of really like teacher scholar type model. And so even if you hate teaching, you know, don't put that on your teaching statement. But, you know, being honest about wanting to get more experience and wanting to learn and being excited about that part of your job. Like Martha said, just be yourself, be as genuine as you can, because, you know, everybody's got that bullshit detector, excuse my language. And no matter what, you know, you want to end up in the best possible situation. And the people who are interviewing you want you to be successful. And so by, you know, being honest about what you need and is absolutely the best way, I think, to get that. And that includes places where you're not as confident. I hope that helped.
And one little piece I'll add just kind of really quick too. I know Toby mentioned classes. The other thing to think about too in terms of developing stuff, even if you're kind of in your last year of your PhD or things like that, a lot of universities, you know, they themselves try to provide educational opportunities as it surrounds like teaching, but also, you know, the various kind of DEI offices, they all have slightly different names, you know, across the university I've been at. They do workshops, they bring in guest speakers. And so it's one of those things where, you know, you can pretty well engage with some of those things. And I would encourage you to kind of keep an open mind to kind of look and see what's available. Because one of the things that I don't think many universities do very well is they don't make it clear that a lot of those things are open to grad students and postdocs. You know, they're often not these super seat limited situations. You know, during my PhD, I started going to like, you know, maybe 1 or 2 a year of like workshops that the Office of Teaching and Learning was doing. It wasn't apparent that that's like though they were open to grad students, but when you ask them, they're just like, yeah, of course grad students can come. And the postdoc situation was similar. Like both the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion and the Office of Teaching and Learning were just like, yeah, of course, you know, if you want to come and learn more. So kind of keep that in mind too. There's probably a lot of resources that you might not be aware of because unfortunately it's just like not, I don't want to say marketed, but it's like not really marketed towards grad students, but often participation is an option. And again, it shows that initiative like I care about these things, I want to learn about these things, I want to be better about these things, whether it's research, teaching, extension, or DEI efforts.
I'm going to tag right to that because that's exactly what I was going to offer, and I'll just push it a little bit harder. You should have a workshop professional development section on your CV. Go find these things. And whether you can implement them or not, you should be really thinking about what's the implication of this for me? How would this affect what I do? So I want to push a little bit more on the DEI side of it, because really there's no reason everybody should have a lot of thoughts. And it can be very helpful to go through different trainings or workshops, read. You can read, like make it your project to read every day if this hasn't been your thing. Read, 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 read. Think about it. What does it mean? Because how do you do your research? How does your research impact equity and inclusion? How does it help us have a more just world? And you might think, well, how does reproduction of sharks have an impact? But it does. So what is it that you do and how you do your work, who you work with, how you seek connection, who you communicate with? How are you trying to do things in your everyday that makes a difference? Everybody should be able to talk about this. And so the more that you do different kinds of efforts and then reflect on what you are doing, you will change. And you can talk about that. This is how I'm doing this in my research. This is what I want to see. This is a world I'm hoping to help bring about. It's really helpful if you do applied research, because I think that often comes, there are massive inequities out there. How does it matter what's happening with fish? It matters. So how have you integrated it, et cetera? So I just really want to promote that as something that will, again, make you stand out a bit too. Because just as Travis said, I think a lot of people are unaware that these opportunities exist. They're on every single campus. They're outside of the campus environment. You can find these workshops online. There are amazing people leading amazing stuff. So strategically pick ones that really interest you and do them, and think about what you learned and how you're going to do it, and do it. And then you can talk about it.
And let me just add, it can be, obviously I am not an ethnic minority. So for folks who are not themselves an ethnic minority, but are allies, you can get involved in groups that are mostly for minority students. You oftentimes get involved as an ally, and those groups are everywhere. I'm involved with, we have a group called Miss Minorities in Shark Science. I'm not a minority, but I'm affiliated, I'm a friend, so I could support them. And there's Black and Marine Science, there's Black Girls Dive. So in my field, there are groups that are already working on this. And, we should all already be supporting and working towards those groups. If you are in a position to do so, but also that's a really good way to kind of show that that's something that you value. And so, but again, like Martha said, you don't necessarily know that those things exist unless you go looking for them. If you are, you're white and you don't think you can get involved, then I don't know. I think you're wrong. I think it's your job to get involved. And so those groups are out there. They're probably something to do with your field. Others, like just joining the SCB Student Affairs Committee, in that position, you could advocate for increased representation. You could organize a student workshop about minorities in science and what you need to know and how you need to go about it. So, don't be shy. This is stuff we should all be doing. If you need an excuse to do it for your application, you should definitely do that. But also, women are considered a minority in science. So, encouraging the participation of underrepresented groups, achieving equality and justice is, there's a lot of ways to do it. If there's no specific tie-in with your research and kind of making the world a better place, then that's always an option, is to lend your energy and your time to a volunteer organization that you can, show your support for and potentially engage, ideally, in like years-long relationship with.
Yeah, and one little piece I'll add too is just that, I was talking about like thinking about the holes on your CV. You also need to like want to do these things, because if you are someone who like, oh, I did 5 workshops and that's the extent of it, and then you go and talk, like that not being genuine in your application packets come out. If it's just someone who's like, look, I did 5 things, and it's like, well, that doesn't really show me a whole lot. Like, how are you able to talk about these things? What are your plans going forward? Why did you do these things to begin with? Like, why do these things matter? Like, for all of the pieces, that's something that's important. Like, that's one of the things why fit comes up and things like that so much, because there's not some magic number for anything, whether you're talking about number of workshops on teaching or number of publications. There aren't magic numbers for any of the evaluation for these things. It does come down to like doing good work and, in a lot of ways, like being a good person that people are going to want to have in their department and things like that.
Yeah, let me just tag team onto that, because I've heard it a bunch of times. And now that I've sat on a few committees, I think it's really true. It's like by the time someone gets to a faculty on-site interview, they know a lot about you. Everybody's read your application materials. They've Googled you. They probably looked at your social media and your LinkedIn page. at that point where you're giving the interview, they're looking at who they want to sit down the hall from for the next 30 years. And I think it's kind of true. Not that there's not ways to screw up the interview, because there are, but you know, there's no downsides really to showing the who you are on a human level, because just like Travis said really well, you know, if you're faking it because you think, you know, you need to check a box to show that you're interested in diversity, then you're not going to be able to talk genuinely about why diversity is important. And so yeah, make sure you really believe what you're saying. It's good, always good advice.
Maybe one thing related to that. I know there's a chat question, but I just want to mention too, because we talked about the application package and it's come up a little bit, this like on campus thing. And so I'll give just like the 30-second breakdown of that. So like if you apply, you get a Zoom interview, generally speaking, and then they pick the top three. And for the most part, if you're in the top three, it means they're interested in giving you an offer, right? Like you made it to kind of the top. They're not going to spend all this money to fly you out unless they're considering giving you an offer. Generally, the format varies a little bit from like day and a half to 2 days on campus. And yeah, it'll involve potentially research and teaching demonstrations, but a lot of it's just one-on-one meetings with various folks. You get to meet with the department head and the dean, the search committee. You're going to be doing meals with search committees or other faculty. And it really comes down to some of those bits of like, the committee, at least I find it, are a little bit stressed because they're potentially trying to sort out who they're going to be down the hall from for 30 years. Like, I find that very stressful, at least. I'm like, it's a little tricky to kind of sort that out in 48 hours. But that's what a lot of the on-campus pieces are, is like, yeah, you can do some really terrible stuff and kind of blow it, but there's a lot of like nuance there of just who might we be able to collaborate or co-teach with, or just, make it so we're not dreading the drive to work every morning. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of part of it.
All right, fantastic. This is a really great discussion. I do want to get to Jeremy's question in the chat, and then I will just say if anybody has any other really burning questions, go ahead and stick them in the chat, but otherwise this will probably be the last one we take. Okay, so Jeremy wants to know, what are your thoughts on being a field person for a professor? I'm finishing my master's in biology and would like to work for a professor. Collecting field data such as plant and soil samples, how would I reach out to a professor for such a position, and what suggestions do you have?
So in some ways, I think that might be a somewhat different one from becoming the professor. So I'm not quite clear if I have that straight. I'm a field person. I'm the kind of person that I could have gone to that job that Toby couldn't. Give me some duct tape and I'm fine. But I think that to find positions, one of the things that you might want to be doing is just look wherever it is that you want to live or want to work, and just scan what people are doing. And you can go ahead and try to send them a message that says, this is what I have done, these are my skills, this is what I'd like to do. There will be this webinar coming up on November 13th on government positions, which a lot of those are field based. Some of them are temporary. That's an issue, that some of them are not very long, but there are a lot of them. And that can be a great place to get experience and continue on. There always will be field-based professor positions out there, and they're really fun. It's one of my favorite things, is stomping around in the mud with students and seeing the seasons change around me and thinking thoughts. There's a lot to do out there, so there's still a lot of options out there.
I can jump in. It really just varies with the professor. What they do will tell you, or you can ask them yourself. For instance, some people do mostly field work. Some people, the computer is their field work. Some people do it seasonally, like me. And and that's good to know about yourself, that that's what you like. I think that's pretty common for a lot of us. I don't know any biologist who's like, when I was little, I wanted to sit in a small room by myself when I grow up. You know, we become scientists because we're like, oh my God, sharks, you know, and I never grew out of that. But one thing that it's important to know is that that's, you know, kind of the fun part, you know, that's kind of the part we all want to do. And some point, I know I personally get very wary because, you know, being out in the field with sharks is cool. People want to do it. But I'm a molecular ecologist. There's no such thing as a shark biologist except on television. And the people that come out of my lab are molecular ecologists, whatever it is that they work on. And so you want to be careful because saying like, I just really want to get into the field kind of ignores the fact that that's just a part of a bigger project. And so for me, I have a lot of undergrads who I work with. They do a lot of genetics in the lab, and in the summertime, if there's field opportunities, you know, that's what they do because they need both kinds of training. But I've had people come to me and say, hey, I want to do research with you, but I'm not interested in lab work. But, you know, if you ever need anybody to help with shark fishing, let me know. And it's like, that's never going to happen because that's the fun part. When there's time to go shark fishing, it's the people who've been working in the genetics lab on the science who are going to go. And so make sure that while you know what it is that's going to make you happy, like, right, you don't want to be inside all the time. That's totally valid. Knowing that about yourself is important. But make sure you remember that everything you do, whether it is shark fishing or entering things into a database for weeks on end or scrubbing a dead fish freezer with a toothbrush, it's all, you know, you kind of have to do it all. And because if you're only in it for the fun stuff, then you're not a scientist. You're, you know, you're on vacation. So definitely reach out, find those people who have a field component to their work. But just know anything that you end up doing, unless you're a technician working for somebody else and that's all you do is field work, but that you don't need grad school for that. You know, just make sure that you understand the importance of every job in science because you know, that's the stuff that will determine whether or not you can get back into the field, is if the inside part with the analysis and the writing and the publishing and the whatever, that has to be good too, or else you won't have any funding to go back in the field.
Yeah, I would just really encourage that self-reflection of like, what stuff do you want to do, right? Like if you really like teaching, you know, applying for an 80% research is not going to lead you to be very happy. You know, I have this discussion with my students all the time, right? And like when we get applicants, there's other things you can do with a PhD and postdoc experience in biology. So when we're reviewing applicants, it's like, well, why do they want to be a professor? You know, there has to be some aspect of either like the teaching or the extension or the mentoring. There's got to be some other pieces there. Um, or else it's like, why not go work for USGS or USDA or the US Forest Service or go to a private company? You know, I also do, you know, genomics work and like I could make a bunch more money if I decided to go to private industry and move to California. But that's that would eliminate the part that I really like, which is like the mentorship and the teaching and kind of like the experimental design pieces and some of this other stuff, right? Um, and so just think about like what's the percentage that you want to be doing and what are the parts that you have as kind of like deal breakers. You know, when I was looking for faculty positions, I've done a chunk of environmental DNA work. Um, Environmental DNA work's not something that like personally is super important to me to be able to process samples in-house. If you've ever done eDNA work, there's like special stuff you need in terms of separate lab space and some other things. But I knew that like I'm okay having to write grants for my eDNA work is going to be more expensive because I don't want to have that space constraint. So again, just kind of like thinking about what some of those pieces might be. I did want to be able to process some tissue samples for genetic stuff, so I did want a lab space. You know, again, I don't think if I was just given, you know, for some of our faculty, they just have what we actually refer to as the fieldwork shed, like locker system, and that's great, but like I need a little bit more than that, and I didn't want to sacrifice that piece. I like GIS and spatial stuff, so like I needed a cluster I wanted to be at a university that had some like good computer performance stuff. So again, really think about like what are the parts that you need, what makes you happy, what doesn't, because the more you deviate away from what you actually want and need, the harder it is to gonna be to actually like find a job, or worse, you get it and then you're miserable.
All right. Um, well, I think we had this session technically scheduled until 5, but we can wrap up as people are running out of questions. If there's anything else anybody wants to know, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand.
One thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put my I don't know if our email was in the VIP, but I'm gonna put my email in the chat and I'll just say like I'm happy to answer questions afterwards as well. One of the things I really stress with my own students, right, is to reach out to lots of folks. The better mentorship structure is some sort of like mentor network and not necessarily some like linear chain of command in a lab. The more different people you can connect with, the better.
I have some thoughts too that I would like to get in there before we go, which is about women applying for faculty jobs, because this is a sort of a special case. I actually have a partner who's a man who is also an academic, and he was applying for jobs at the same time I was, and the second time. And what's interesting is I read an article that talked about how men and women look at the job requirements of a given job ad and decide whether or not to apply. And it's funny because I experienced this in real time. But basically what happens is you get a job ad that has all of these attributes. It's like, I want someone who does GIS and can do evolution and can do genomics and can do ecology and knows all of the plants and also maybe can, teach physiology. Women tend to look at a list like that and say, I don't have all of those things. I can't apply for that job. Men will look at the same exact job and say, oh, I have a couple of those. I can apply. And this is applicable because my husband and I had the exact opposite reactions. I was like, oh, there's one or two things on that list that I can do. Heck yeah. Like, sure, I can be an actual geneticist. I can spin that. I could do that. So for me, I ended up applying for like way more jobs than my husband did. And the point is, you never know what the faculty are looking for. They don't put all of those listed qualities on there because they expect one person to have them all. Those are just kind of, things that they're looking for. Probably any combination of those would be good. And so take a chance, worst comes to worst, you don't hear back. Ideally, like Travis was saying, you have enough of you're able to punch out applications fast enough because they're similar, but not so fast that it becomes impersonal. You kind of get into this rhythm where you can really customize those things and do it well, but not take a ton of time. And so, you put them out there. I think I put in like 70 applications one year. And if you're not sure, and if you're not sure, then go for it, right? Why not? But I got a lot more responses than my husband did because he didn't send out as many jobs and job ads. And so that's something that is interesting and kind of stereotypical that you want to watch out for. Another thing is that I find, especially when I talk with other female friends, is that the negotiating phase can be especially, I mean, I think it's stressful for everyone. I only have my own perspective, but women faculty members, we don't make as much salary as men do. Part of that is because of sexual inequality throughout society, but part of it is because in academia, your starting salary defines what you're going to be making over the course of your career. Like your raises, when you get tenure, when you get a promotion, when you get to full professor, every raise that you get is a percentage of your starting salary. And so it's important to negotiate in the beginning. But it can be scary, right? Especially for women who we are conditioned to want to be likable, especially with a group of people that we're hoping to join. We're hoping these people are going to be our friends and our peers. And so it can feel wrong and yucky to, argue persuasively that this is something you should get. We're also not good about bragging on ourselves, and because we think we're arrogant or whatever. And that's something you have to be able to do in an interview, in an application. You have to be able to promote yourself, not, not like an arrogant jerk, but you have to be willing, you have to be assertive. You have to be willing to do that. And, not like, ah, shucks, I haven't done anything. And let's, okay, I'm not going to give you this job. So the other thing is during negotiations, you want to make sure that you can do what you told them that you can. You know what I mean? So if you say, yes, I'm going to do genomics, and they say, okay, we have no startup for you. You're going to have to come in, find grant money, and build your lab from scratch. Well, okay, then I'm not going to be productive right away. I'm not necessarily going to be able to do what I said I was going to be able to do. So that's maybe not a good fit for me. They want you to succeed. If they've decided to make you an offer, they want you to come there and they want you to be successful. And so the chair, the dean, ideally those are your allies in that process. And so, you don't have to be worried about coming off pushy if you can make a case for, look, this is what I need. You want me to be able to do X, Y, and Z. This is what I need. And it's not about being liked, even though it feels that way. Like I said, it's just part of the process. It's just something that I think is really hard on a sort of personal, emotional level. And sometimes it can be, very stressful. But again, that's not something you should be afraid to ask. When you're talking to faculty members there, when you're on interviews, you can say, if it's not listed in the ad, what is the expected salary? What kind of startup do you guys usually get? Is there shared equipment that's available? Will I have to buy a scanning electron microscope, or, will I need that for startup, or is there one that I can use? So, being as sort of realistic as you can, even though it's hard, if you're not really sure, it's understandable, but, just know that being assertive in that situation is okay. Obviously, you're not going to be an arrogant jerk, but being honest about what you need and how awesome you are, that's easy. You just got to kind of be your own fan.
All right, fantastic. I think we'll probably go ahead and wrap this up. I would like to give Travis and Martha especially a chance to add any final comments if you have them.
One little bit that I'll say, just because I saw some faces with Toby's comment about how many applications go out. I know there was a big social media push of just like trying to figure out right now. Again, the job market can be kind of rough. I think on the Eco Evo front, like the average, this was, like just through Twitter at the time, I think. But, it's like pushing like 80-ish apps or so, six, kind of depends on the person. Again, think about like, how to help streamline that process so you don't go crazy, because it can be tricky, but you're all busy. You can't have a full-time job of just finding a job. So it's about trying to think about like, how can I, keep an eye on stuff. There's a ton of job boards. Pretty much everything for me showed up on EcoEvo at some point. So instead of checking a million job boards, I was just checking EcoEvo. So again, like just trying to think a little bit about what that situation looks like anecdotally, from my group of folks. I think the lowest was like low 40s, and then the person who did the most was, yeah, like low 80s. So it's pretty competitive. Again, if you're willing to do like applied and think about kind of the land grantee world, our applicant pools tend to be a little bit smaller if you're interested in natural resources over bio. So that's kind of my kind of plug there too.
I think maybe I'll encourage you to be really selective, though. It's a lot of energy. I'm older than all these folks, so I got my job a while back, right? My jobs. I put in 6 job applications and I got 4 offers. I was really selective about what I applied for, and I really made my case. And I took a lot of time to craft a really, you know, and it was a different time. I will say it was not perceived at the time to be that easy. It's just that um, I think that when you see like this is an institution I could really be, this would be so exciting. This is where I want to be. That shows, and it just doesn't come across in a lot of the applications. So having been on the hiring side, um, I really question the wisdom of 80 applications because I read an awful lot that I bet those, you just felt it just didn't have it. And none of those people even made the short list. So I think some of that effort is wasted effort. So I realize that it's hard. We all want a job, but you might a more a more intensive effort that really is making your case for specific places might be more rewarding in the long run. So, and then I also want to say, I don't know what the range of your interests are. If you're not a sort of an eco-evo person and this job board, you've never heard of it, that's fine. There are lots and lots of places that the jobs are being advertised. And if you have questions, so I work in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. We're like radically interdisciplinary. We put our stuff all over the place when we're asking for positions. So if you are really in a different spot, feel free to reach out to us, and we could maybe offer other places that you might be looking for job ads for academic jobs. But there's a lot out there, and there are a lot of different things to be, and it's really good to do some searching within yourself about what you want. And it's also really good to be preparing yourself for what you want. Like Travis said, kind of work backwards a bit. Oh, I would be so excited if I had something like this. Well, what else might you do now to prepare yourself to get that job and really, really excel in it and be happy in it, most of all.
All right, that's
I'll
great.
chime in sorry,
Okay,
just real
go
quick.
ahead. Yeah.
Because Martha brought up the other places. I found higheredjobs.com really helpful because you could set up like I want job emails and say like I only want to work in these states. Or if you're dual searching, they have a dual search function that'll kind of help highlight some things. So like I know I mentioned Eco, but yeah, Martha mentioned there's lots of other options. Higheredjobs.com is a good one. That'll send you emails with kind of your saved searches.
Yeah, AAUS will do that too. If you're the American Association for the Advancement of Science, right? They're the ones that publish Science, the magazines, the journal magazine. I don't know what it is, but yeah. So just you can get those just like sent to you, so you get kind of a digest of them. And another thing is that sometimes this can it can take 2 years. It can take more than one cycle, especially if, like Martha said, you are being very selective. I don't know if we can all be Martha. I don't know anybody else who got 66% success rate. So pretty sure you're a rock star. Because success rate usually way lower, just so you know. But better you end up with something you love than end up compromising to live in a part of the world you don't really want to live in, or your partner doesn't really want to live in, or it's just going to be too far away from everything else. It's for our profession, having breaks in your CV is not unheard of. It's not the worst thing in the world. And because people know it can take a while to get these jobs, depends on the year, then you have to relocate, stuff happens. And so better, just go into it knowing and maybe being prepared for hey, if I don't find something this cycle, I'll be okay. And then you won't feel forced to like put out an application to every single job that comes along, even if you don't think it's going to be a good fit. In general, everybody I know who has wanted a academic job has found one eventually. So, you know, it's tough for sure, but it's not impossible. And there's so many different kinds of universities out there that, you know, make sure, like my colleagues have said really well, that, you know, you're getting the kind of setup that you need. If you don't want to do a ton of teaching, you know, make sure you're not at a school that's going to give you 3 courses a year, or a semester. And that's okay. It's okay not to like teaching. It's okay to want to do just teaching. It's better to know that about yourself than not and end up in a place where you're not happy. So having a backup plan, if you need to go for more than one cycle, having a backup to the backup is always a good thing. So you're not feeling pressed.
Okay, with that, I think we'll probably call it a day. Um, I want to say huge thank you to Travis, Martha, and Toby, our speakers. This is a really, really good discussion. I think we have a lot of good information that can be out there. The session was recorded and it will be on YouTube for anybody who wants to come back to it later. Also want to say big thanks to Bernie because he does a lot of the behind the scenes stuff and getting these sessions going. So thanks, Bernie. With that, I guess we can go ahead and shut it down, but thanks everyone for coming.